Hi everyone, Samson's Donkey Jawbone here, and we're here for another video. This time we're going to be debunking a video by Ash Mays. He's sort of this up-and-coming Christian YouTuber. He recently only admitted that he's actually a Christian, but he's sort of been hobnobbing with well-known Christian missionaries and apologists on YouTube, and he recently made this sort of screed against Rabbinic Judaism and claims to have debunked it. Obviously, his criticisms are trivially refuted, so I'm going to spend that time doing so right now. So let's get started.
The claim of rabbinic tradition is that alongside the Torah given at Sinai, there was another oral law given alongside, and this was passed down from Moses all the way to what became the rabbis.
So right away, we have what is effectively a straw man of the rabbinic position. So at this point, I'm going to give an affirmative case for the rabbinic position, just so it's extremely clear. The claim is not that there was an oral Torah given alongside the written Torah at Sinai. That's just totally a misrepresentation of what the rabbinic claim is. Rather, the rabbinic, the correct position, is that there was one tradition given at Sinai, or more precisely, one revelation given at Sinai, and then parts of that tradition were abridged in the form we know as the written Torah. Meaning, there is only one cohesive tradition, and that encompasses laws, it encompasses Agadata, which are non-legal stories, it encompasses Kabbalistic, esoteric mysticism, and it encompasses the commandments, the laws, as I mentioned, which are typically referred to as the Torah, or the Torah that Moses commanded. This is going to come up later in the video where Ash sort of tries to claim that the fact that the Torah mentions that people are reading from or writing from the Torah that Moses commanded or the commandments that Moses gave, that this somehow implies that that was the only revelation at Sinai. It's important to think of the revelation at Sinai as sort of like a university lecture where a great amount of details and information was given over, and then later on the Torah was written down in an abridged version, and these notes are what we now know as the five books of Moses. And the five books of Moses contain all the commandments. The oral Torah does not contain any additional commandments that are not found or derived from the five books of Moses. Therefore, when passages in Tanakh refer to the Torah of Moses or to the commandments that Moses commanded, we're referring to the written Torah. But this does not preclude the extra details that surround every commandment. So this is going to come up a bunch in Ash's video. He sort of brings up these verses to say, see, this is referring to the written Torah, and therefore there cannot be any details within the written commandments that go beyond what is literally written in the text. Now, this is obviously false. I mean, it's explicit in the text itself, in fact, but it also just falls to basic logical reasoning. After all, the Torah is not like a Greek or English Bible. The Torah is, for one thing, it's an abjad. It's a Semitic abjad, which means, number one, it has no vowels. It also happens to have no punctuation. That means no quotation marks. That means no periods, no commas, which inherently means that reading the Torah is filled with ambiguities, and that's not all. Even if you were to know all of the vowelization, you would not know where sentences start or stop. The Torah also makes use of poetic language where it switches tenses from past to future to present tense. It uses plural verbs where there should be singular verbs. It uses feminine verbs where there should be masculine verbs. Effectively, there's just a jumble of all sorts of ambiguities in the written Torah that make it impossible, not just difficult, impossible to parse without some form of extraneous knowledge which is not written in the text. The Torah also, in terms of content, is filled with contradictions. and redundancies. For example, the Torah says that a man may not marry his brother's wife. However, it simultaneously says that a man must marry his brother's wife if his brother has died in levirate marriage. This is a contradiction. We need some sort of hermeneutic principle that exists outside of the written Torah in order to reconcile this contradiction. Now, the rabbis provide many such principles, but without such principles, there would be no way to know if the negative commandment should supersede the positive commandment or vice versa. Moreover, to claim that there's no content outside of the written Torah that interprets the written Torah at the time that it was given is just simply nonsensical on its face. One would have to presume that Moses had no idea what a pre-Eitz Hadar, the fruit of a beautiful tree, was when that commandment was given. Obviously, he must have known what was meant by that commandment when it was given in order to fulfill it properly at the time it was given, unless you want to say that they weren't actually fulfilling the commandments in the Torah. We have explicit references to details that exist outside of the written corpus of the five books of Moses. Most famously, Deuteronomy 12:21, where God tells the Jewish people to slaughter as I have commanded you. This commandment is obviously found nowhere in the five books of Moses. This means, if the Torah is to be believed, that there was some commandment given as to how to slaughter, which is not present in the five books of Moses. This, then, by definition, is the very oral Torah which Ash is seeking to debunk. Once again, this is trivially proven from both basic logic, explicit verses, and the inherent ambiguity of the text of the Torah. If you believe that the Torah had any meaning at the time that it was given at Sinai, then by necessity one must say that there was an interpretative tradition alongside the Torah, or more precisely, that there was an all-encompassing tradition from the revelation at Sinai, parts of which were then written down in the written Torah. This is the comprehensive rabbinic position, and it is unassailable. Unless, again, one wishes to claim that people were not actually performing the commandments, one must say that there was some form of interpretation that allowed one to extract content from the Torah that is not clear from the written content alone.
And the rabbis have an authority going back to Moses to interpret this tradition, and it was only compiled in the 2nd century for the first time out of necessity.
Again, this is not strictly true. The rabbinic position is not that the oral Torah was never written down or that it was never allowed to be written down at all. Rather, it was written down at various intervals in small pieces. People took notes. The academies at Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai and later at Yavne and many other academies all had written compilations of said notes of the oral Torah. But yes, by and large, it was memorized, and then Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi redacted those many different sets of collections of notes in the 3rd century CE. So it is not correct to say that it was never written down. We don't have any extant copies, but you can be sure that the academies of Hillel and Shammai had many such written notes in order to facilitate their discussions therein.
What we're going to be doing today is demonstrating that the claim of Rabbinic Judaism that the oral tradition goes back to Moses, that the rabbis have authority going back to Moses, that these claims are false. We're not going to get into what different groups of Jewish people say about, is it the whole oral Torah, or all the debates in the Talmud actually cited at Sinai, simply that there is an oral tradition at all that goes back to Moses, and that the rabbis are a continuation of that authority. We're not going to get into too much detail about which claims. Even at the most fundamental level, does that exist at all? Are those claims at all true? And again, I say no, and I'm going to demonstrate with evidence in this video.
So again, as I've already demonstrated, the inherent ambiguity of the written Torah requires that there be some sort of interpretation in order to extract meaning from it. Therefore, this claim of Ash is trivially proven false, because, as he said, he wishes to debunk the idea that at minimum there was some tradition outside of the written text from Sinai. Once again, even if one were to just limit oneself to the tradition of the vowelization, this was already an oral tradition. It was not written down, and even if it was written down, it would be content outside of the five books of Moses, which would again be the exact claim that Ash is attempting to debunk, given that we know that there was meaning extracted from the Torah. We know that there was some sort of understanding of the Torah that was outside of the written text, and that that understanding was the correct understanding as was intended by God, and that there was only one such understanding. Now, you might then ask, okay, fine, I agree that there is inherent ambiguity, but how do we know that the rabbi's interpretation is correct? Perhaps there can be many subjective interpretations, and whatever anyone wants to interpret out of the text goes. And okay, so the pre-Eitz Hadar can just be any tree that I happen to subjectively find beautiful. So once again, this is still not a defensible position. From Deuteronomy 12:21, it is trivial to prove there's not just subjective perceptions that were left to the reader to interpret for themselves, but rather there were explicit commandments given outside of the Torah. Deuteronomy 12:21 explicitly says that Hashem commanded the Jewish people to slaughter in a particular way. So once more, this is trivially debunked using one verse. Now, in terms of the rabbinic authority, whether that stems from Sinai, this is once again very simply proven from Deuteronomy 17. This is the passage in question. If a matter eludes you in judgment, between blood and blood, between judgment and judgment, or between legion and legion, words of dispute in your cities, then you shall rise and go up to the place the Lord your God chooses, and you shall come to the Levitic Kohanim, and to the judge who will be in those days, and you shall inquire, and they will tell you the words of judgment, and you shall do according to the word they tell you, from the place the Lord will choose, and you shall observe to do according to all they instruct you. According to the law they instruct you, and according to the judgment they say to you, you shall do, you shall not divert from the word they tell you, either right or left. So, these verses explicitly lay out that there is an authoritative interpretive body which exists to tell you what the legal interpretation of the commandments are. Now, this body happened to be called the Sanhedrin. And as you can see from verse 11, the Sanhedrin was incontrovertible. You did not have permission to divert at all from the commandments of the Sanhedrin. They had incontrovertible authority. In fact, they were, according to many opinions, infallible. This is explicit in the verses we have mentioned, as well as other verses that we're going to bring up later, and nowhere in the body of the Tanakh or anywhere else in Jewish history was it ever indicated that the Sanhedrin ever lost its infallibility or authority, and that we were ever permitted to divert from its ways in any way. And if you believe the Torah is an eternal document, which I and other Orthodox Jews do, then this commandment is still fully in effect, and you are required to abide by the decisions of the Sanhedrin, which have been codified in the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds.
The first problem, and this should be enough for most people, is that the oral tradition, the oral law, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, as it's called, is simply missing from the Torah. It's not mentioned or referenced at all. It doesn't exist. It's never mentioned. None of the famous biblical figures are ever cited as doing anything from the rabbinic law, participating in anything from the rabbinic law, referencing the rabbinic law. The only time you ever see that is later stories, Aggadic stories in the rabbinic tradition about those biblical figures, but it's nowhere in the written scriptures.
Once again, Ash's claim is that in Tanakh, there is no record of any figure abiding by said rabbinic tradition. Now, again, the rabbinic tradition just means details of laws that are not explicit in the five books of Moses. And here in Nehemiah chapter 10, we have explicitly details of laws which are not explicit in the five books of Moses. And not only that, these commandments are referred to as the Torah of God, which was given through Moses, the servant of God, and to keep and perform all the commandments of the Lord our God and his ordinances and his statutes. So here we explicitly, in verse 32, have a commandment not to bring merchandise and grains on the Sabbath day to sell. Now again, in the verses concerning the Sabbath in the five books of Moses, the only prohibition mentioned is the general work prohibition and the prohibition of making fire. There is no prohibition of buying or selling merchandise. There is no prohibition of carrying, as is also referenced in the book of Jeremiah. There would be no way from the 5 books of Moses alone to know that you cannot buy or sell merchandise on the Sabbath. Therefore, Ash's claim by necessity must be false.
But for a lot of Jews following the rabbinic system, the stories about those figures being in the Tanakh are enough to move them in the direction of still believing it. And so what we need to do is actually present stronger evidence than that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to point to a series of verses from the Tanakh, mostly from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, as it were, that explicitly rule out the possibility of an oral law accompanying the Torah. In Exodus chapter 24, verses 4 through 7, Moses explicitly is said to be writing down all the commandments of God, and when he presents it to the Jewish people, they say they will do all of what God has commanded. Everything that God receives, that Moses receives from God, he puts into writing, he reads it to the Israelites, and they accept all of that teaching, all of that law.
So, Exodus 24, 4 through 7. Moses then wrote down all the commands of Hashem. So once again, the only reason that Ash believes that this is some sort of debunking is because he's operating with a straw man that the oral Torah means some sort of separate commands from the written Torah. But again, the written Torah is merely an abridged version of the full rabbinic tradition. So when we say Moses wrote down all the commands of Hashem, we're simply saying, as the rabbis would agree, that Moses wrote down the commands of Hashem, the explicit written headlines of Hashem's commandments, the details of which were left to the all-encompassing rabbinic tradition. This does not contradict the rabbinic claim, and so Ash's claim is trivially dismissed.
Exodus chapter 34, verse 27, God commands Moses once more, and this is showing, if anything, progressive revelation of the Torah within the written scriptures, no external, it's all written down in what we have today, written down as the Torah. But God explicitly tells Moses to write down his commands, write down all of these things, and with these things I make my covenant with Israel. No oral law mentioned, all the things that Moses is writing down. That's the covenant with Israel.
Once again, Exodus 34, this is once again not a contradiction to the rabbinic claim. Hashem said to Moses, write down these commandments. Yes, Moses wrote down the general guidelines of the commandments in the 5 books of Moses, the details of which were left to the rabbinic tradition. Moving on.
Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 9, Moses writes down the law again and gives it to the Kohanim, to the priests, the sons of Levi, who are the priesthood, and commands them to guard it. That is the prerogative of the priesthood, not the rabbis, and it's all written down. This is going to become important later when we discuss debates between factions in the Second Temple period. Enough of that for now. We're going to get to it later.
So Deuteronomy 31, the same thing. Moses wrote down this teaching, gave it to the priests, etc., etc. Once again, Moses writing down the Torah, yes, is referring to the written Torah, but this does not exclude the details of said written Torah existing in the tradition, nor does it exclude other facets of the tradition, such as esoteric mysticism, Agadita, and so forth. Now, it's actually really interesting that the fact that Ash brought this verse is that it actually explicitly debunks his position. So his position is that only a written Torah was given at Sinai, and then there was never any sort of oral tradition by which the people were to abide by the laws. Of course, the problem here is that verse 9 is this is taking place at the end of the 40 years in the desert. That's when Moses wrote down the entirety of the Torah, which means that prior to that moment, for 40 years, the people were abiding by what is it? Wait for it, an oral tradition. That's right. So it's really truly astounding that Ash brought this verse as a support for him, when, again, it makes the exact opposite point that he's trying to make explicitly, that the tradition was originally oral in nature, and then parts of it were then written down, as is explicit in the verses that he brought.
But enough to say that the priests are given the law to uphold and to guard and to teach the people. Not a rabbinical class, not a teaching class, and no oral tradition.
So, once again, this is explicitly disproven by the text in Deuteronomy 17, where in verse 9 we are told that you shall come to the Levitic Kohanim, and to the judge who will be in those days. The judge who will be in those days refers to the non-Levitic rabbis who will be in all generations, of whom you shall inquire. In Numbers 11, we see the first explicit reference to the Sanhedrin, specifically Numbers 11, verse 24. Moses went out and told the people what the Lord had said, and he assembled 70 men of the elders of the people, and he stood them around the tent. These 70 men correspond exactly to the 70 elders of the Sanhedrin, which existed in every generation of the Jewish people until the dissolution of the Sanhedrin. The Lord descended in a cloud and spoke to him, and he increased some of the Spirit that was on him being Moses, and bestowed it onto the 70 elders. When the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, but they did not continue. So what do we see here? We see that the authority that was given to Moses is explicitly then, some of it is taken from Moses and bestowed onto the 70 elders, or the Sanhedrin. These 70 elders are later then referenced throughout the Torah and Tanakh as being the ones to whom the people would come in judgment. This then is the shofet to whom the verse in Deuteronomy 17:11 refers, as well as the explicit references to listening to and going to the elders for judgment.
Joshua chapter 8, verses 34 through 35, Joshua gets up before the assembly of Israel, and it says he read them all of what Moses commanded. He read the whole Torah to them, and it says not a word of what Moses commanded did he not read to them. How could there be an oral tradition if all of what Moses commanded, which would imply anything else additional, he read it all to them? All of it was written down and read to them, not taught orally, written down and read to them, to all of Israel. Again, explicitly excluding the possibility of an oral tradition of any kind. And if there was ever a verse in the Tanakh that is an indictment of the rabbinical system, it's Joshua chapter 23, verse 6. He says to the people, Joshua does, to keep the Torah, the written Torah, and not to stray from it to the right or to the left. Now, this is another one of those passages that the rabbis co-opt, twist the meaning to the complete reverse, and say, oh, that means don't deviate right or left from what the rabbis say, or don't deviate right or left from what the oral tradition says. But it's explicitly a written Torah that he's saying do not deviate from. Again, an explicit indictment of the idea of a rabbinical oral tradition. It says explicitly it's written and do not stray from it right or left.
So once again, for the last time, the commandments in the written Torah are elucidated in the rabbinic tradition. They are not adding any commandments. These are the same commandments which are in the written Torah. In order to follow them, you must observe the rabbinic tradition. He also mixes up this verse with Deuteronomy 17:11 because it also says not to deviate to the right or to the left. It's a minor point, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's never actually become familiar with these verses. He doesn't really study them in depth. He's just parroting surface level talking points that he read somewhere else. So he saw something about to the right and to the left, and he mixed it up with Deuteronomy 17:11, which is the actual source of rabbinic authority, because again, all commandments are sourced in the 5 books of Moses, not in the book of Joshua. We don't source rabbinic authority from the book of Joshua, it's from the book of Deuteronomy.
Now, if this wasn't enough that the Torah explicitly rules out an oral tradition, even if we were to say that maybe there's some teachings or traditions at all that go back to Moses in any way, shape, or form, we can rule that out as well, because it is obvious that Moses didn't have a tradition. Either that, or he forgot about it, or it failed miserably in its purpose, because there are numbers of verses, 4 explicit that I can think of, where it demonstrates that if there was ever an oral tradition given at Sinai, either Moses forgot it or it failed in its mission. Leviticus 24, Numbers 9, Numbers 15, Numbers 27, all cases where Moses doesn't know what to do, and he does not consult the 70 elders of Israel, who are the first Sanhedrin. He doesn't consult these people as some kind of bearers of an oral tradition. He himself doesn't know the oral tradition, so either he never had it or he forgot it. He consults directly with God, and he has to wait for answers because he simply does not know what to do. If there was an oral tradition, there would have been an answer there. Now, you might say, well, this shows progressive revelation, and not all of it was written at Sinai. Well, exactly. God does have some kind of progressive revelation, but it's all written in the written Torah. Moses wrote these things down. It doesn't matter that he wrote one at Sinai. Everything is being written. That's why we have it in the written Torah. Even those events where Moses didn't know what to do, consulted with God, and got a new answer of what to do, he writes that down. That's how we have it today.
So once again, this is a total straw man of the rabbinic position. Ash is, of course, totally unfamiliar with the fact that the rabbinic position does include the opinion that the Torah was revealed progressively over the course of the 40 years. Of course, this does preclude progressive revelation after the death of Moses, because after Moses, there was no prophet that arose like him ever again. This refers to his ability to write down binding law for the rest of time. However, during the life of Moses, yes, it was certainly possible for God to give a new commandment here, a new commandment there, and that explains all of the passages that Ash brings up. And of course, he doesn't address the fact that even according to the opinion that all of the Torah was given at Sinai, there are rabbinic responses to the verses in which Moses doesn't know a law, either that this was a detail of the law which was not explicitly given in the general guidelines which were given to Moses, or that Moses simply forgot it. Rashi cites a tradition, for instance, for the daughters of Zelophehad, that Moshe forgot supernaturally, he was caused to forget the laws of the daughters of Zelophehad in order to honor the daughters of Zelophehad so that their names would be mentioned in the Torah with regards to that law. So yes, the rabbinic tradition is aware of these verses. Yes, they are addressed. Yes, this is not inconsistent with the rabbinic position. Whether or not the Torah was given fully at Sinai or progressively throughout the 40 years in the desert, this is totally consistent. So either Ash is just totally unfamiliar with the rabbinic position, or he's lying, or both. But either way, this does not contradict the rabbinic position. So we move onwards.
And again, if that weren't enough, there is a passage in 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23 where it completely rules out the notion that there could be any continuity at all from Sinai with an oral tradition till today. Completely rules it out. Because in the time of King Josiah, Yoshiyahu, the entire nation of Israel has forgotten the entire Torah. The evil kings before have brought in idol worship. They don't know how to do worship of God. They're worshiping idols. They don't know the sacrifices. They don't know the holidays. They're not keeping anything properly at all, mostly out of ignorance. They just don't have the Torah. They don't know what to do. And what happens? The priest at the time and a scribe find the entirety of the Torah, present it to the king, to Josiah, Yoshiyahu, and what does he do? He repents. He completely changes Israel back to the law of God because they now have the Torah. So they didn't know it before, now they do it, and they completely return to Israel. Israel completely returned to God. They tear down all the idols, they restore the worship properly, they do the holidays properly. It says that it was the first time since the time of the judges that they did the Passover sacrifice properly, that they did that whole Passover properly. If there was an oral tradition going back to Moses, how could they have forgotten what to do? Even if they lost all the scrolls, somebody must have known what to do because the oral tradition accompanies the written tradition. So you'd have to know what the written tradition is saying if you have an oral tradition on it.
Once again, Ash demonstrates his total unfamiliarity with the verses in question. There's no verse that says that in the time of Josiah that the entire nation forgot the Torah. Yes, the nation was very idolatrous, but this occurs throughout the stories in Tanakh. The nation was idolatrous directly after the revelation at Sinai when they worshipped the golden calf. Does that mean that they forgot the Torah? No. It simply means that they were idolatrous because there was an evil inclination for idolatry. There was a desire for idolatry, a lust for idolatry. Rather, what do the verses actually say? In 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 8, Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the scroll of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, and he read it. Now, just from this verse alone, one would, which is the verse that Ash cites, one would think that this is just a generic scroll. However, when one goes to 2 Chronicles 34, it is clear that this scroll is not just an ordinary Torah scroll, and it becomes much more clear why this event is significant, and it has nothing to do with people forgetting the law. Rather, Hilkiah the priest found the scroll of the law of the Lord by the hand of Moses, meaning this was the original Torah scroll, which was written by Moses in the desert. So we see now why this was so significant. There's no indication that people had forgotten the Torah in entirety. As the verses in Tanakh explicitly state, there was always a righteous remnant in Israel remaining in every generation. This righteous remnant preserved the Torah. This, once again, is a clear debunking of Ash's point because he obviously did not read the verses in question.
But if that weren't enough for people, we have to look to the contradictions of the sages to the Torah. So let's look to a few examples of that. In 1 Kings, you have the story of Elijah calling fire from heaven. God brings down the fire from heaven and consumes the altar, and then the people praise and worship God. The Talmud tradition, one of the rabbis says that if the people hadn't praised and worshiped God, the fire from heaven would not have come.
This is such a silly point. The rabbis are not flipping the order of the verses. Rather, this passage in the Jerusalem Talmud is saying that the people were of the caliber that they were in the future to say Hashem Hu Elokim, because they were so meritorious that they would then later say such a thing, that at that time the fire came down from heaven. These people were already meritorious before they said that phrase. It's just that phrase was indicative of the merit that they had already had previously. This is not an inversion of chronology. This is merely a future indication of a past truth that was already in effect. Now you might ask, why would God act on account of a future indication? Okay, he's God. He's outside of time and space. He has no need to be bound by cause and effect. Therefore, this is, once again, not a refutation of anything, and it doesn't contradict the verses as stated. And again, none of the examples Asher brings will contradict, because the inherent ambiguity of text means that interpretations can be wildly varied, and we only know which ones are right because we have an authoritative body, and that body is the Sanhedrin.
What this does is not only contradict the Torah, but it shows the pattern of the rabbis taking authority and power out of God's hands, authority away from the prophets of God, and putting it in the hands of regular people. This is the core of rabbinic ideas. HaTorah lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven, they say. It is up to the rabbis, to the people, to interpret it based on debate and majority.
Lo b'shamayim hi is not a rabbinic idea. It's found explicitly in the Torah in Deuteronomy 30, verse 12. This is, once again, a straw man and a lack of understanding or knowledge of basic verses in the Torah. Torah is not in heaven. This is explicitly stated by God. The authority is explicitly delegated to the Sanhedrin, and therefore all interpretation is subject to the words of the Sanhedrin. That is what the story he's referencing, the Avon and Eknai, is teaching us.
Then we have a rabbi from the Talmud saying that Job never existed, that the whole story is an allegory. And I believe this is a opinion echoed by the Rambam, by Maimonides, one of the great sages of Jewish history. Well, the problem is that Ezekiel in chapter 14 cites Job as a historical figure alongside Daniel and Noah as righteous individuals from the past. So not only is he in the Bible cited as a real person, not only are other prophets citing him as a real person, not only is he in the Bible as a real person, other prophets are also citing him as a real person. Why would he be there if he wasn't real? Why would the Torah tell us he's a real person, never saying it's an allegory, only for rabbis of the Talmud to say it's an allegory and a metaphor? But not only this, the rabbis in the Jerusalem Talmud, or at least one of the sages in the Jerusalem Talmud, contradicts that rabbi and says Job did exist, and he makes up his own story, how Job married the daughter of Jacob.
Okay, so Ezekiel mentions Job. So what? In 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 13, the high places that were before Jerusalem that were on the right of the Mount of the Destroyer, which Solomon king of Israel had built, for Ashtoreth, the abomination of Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the children of Ammon, did the king defile. Are Ashtoreth and Chemosh and Milcom real entities? No, they are not real entities. They are entirely fictional entities, but they are mentioned in the Tanakh because they teach some sort of lesson, or they are relevant to the story. Clearly, at the time of Ezekiel, even if Job was a fictional character, people were aware of that character. So whether or not he was a real character, Ezekiel would have mentioned him to make the point that he was making, that the righteous individuals wouldn't be able to save Jerusalem. Again, this is not a proof that Job was a real or not real character, but the text, because of the inherent ambiguity, certainly allows for this.
Now, this is a very interesting one. In Exodus chapter 4, the wife of Moses circumcises their child. It says she took a flint and she circumcised the baby. Now, the rabbis in the Talmud are debating about which types of people are allowed to and not allowed to circumcise Jewish children. And one of the rabbis is trying to make the case that women are not allowed to circumcise babies. So he cites this story, but then he twists it and says, we know this because she didn't circumcise the baby. She took the flint. Don't read it as she took it. Read it as she took it for someone else. And don't read it as she circumcised, but rather she caused to circumcise, meaning she gave the flint to somebody else to circumcise. So he changes the story to prove that his case that women are not allowed to, under Jewish law, circumcise children. This is another pattern of the rabbis, taking the ability of women to do righteous things away from women in the Jewish people. It's another continuation of that pattern, and he warps and distorts a biblical scripture to make his case to that effect.
So again, the story in question is inherently ambiguous. The Hebrew language is inherently ambiguous. Words can have multiple meanings. So this, once again, is a very valid form of homiletical interpretation that the rabbis are making. Again, I'm not getting into the question of whether or not that verse is literal, but the only point is to say that it certainly could be taken non-literally, and that is all that needs to be proven, which is that the rabbinical interpretation does not contradict the text because, again, you can only understand the text with some form of interpretation because text is always inherently ambiguous.
And finally, we have a rabbi in the Talmud saying that, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, saying that anyone who says that the sons of Eli were wicked or sinful simply doesn't understand what's being said, or simply doesn't understand. The problem is, 1 Samuel chapter 2 unambiguously cites them as wicked and sinful people. So another example of the rabbis, the great sages of Israel, explicitly contradicting the Torah, or the Tanakh, as it were.
Yeah, so the answer here is just going to be the same. I mean, Ash acts as if it's totally impossible for there to be metaphorical language in the Torah. The Torah is filled with metaphorical language. There are idioms found throughout the Torah that even exist today, like, for instance, the apple of one's eye, referring to the object of one's admiration. And there are metaphors, such as the great eagle in Ezekiel. That one's explicitly said to be a metaphor, but there are many unexplicit metaphors, such as Song of Songs. The Torah is filled with metaphors, so when a verse says that the sons of Eli were sinful, it is perfectly valid in terms of interpretation to say that that was metaphorical. That's not a contradiction, that is a interpretation.
But let's add a little more evidence to the case here. So we have the historical case that it can't possibly be true. The first time we see any oral tradition as described of what we know today is the Mishnah, really, in the 2nd century, compiled in the 2nd century, claiming to be from discussions from earlier. It obviously is to an extent from at least the few centuries prior, but not earlier than that. It only cites people up until the 2nd century BC, which is not that far back at that time. They only pop up in history. The early Pharisees that then become the rabbis, they only pop up in about the middle of the 2nd century BC.
Ash is incorrect again. If you want to see where the oral Torah explicitly cites people from far before 200 BCE, you simply need to go to Pirkei Avos, the Ethics of the Fathers, where you will see people as far back as Shimon HaTzadik or Antigonus of Socho being cited. These are people from 300-400 BCE. The oral tradition also contains citations from Ezra. It also contains laws which are explicitly stated to be directly received from Moshe at Sinai. So the claim that the rabbis don't claim tradition older than 200 BCE is silly. And once again, it just proves that he's totally unfamiliar with the texts he's discussing.
But more importantly, they are at odds with other important groups at the time. Now, I want to say, obviously, the Sadducees, the priesthood was very corrupt. That's not the point here, and we're not going to get into the whole history of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But needless to say, the keepers of the law of Moses, the priesthood, they didn't just politically disagree with the Pharisees. They didn't just dislike them. They rejected the idea that there could be an oral Torah. They don't just say, hey, we don't agree with your interpretation. They're like, what are you talking about? That's not a thing. That doesn't exist. Now, there were some priests that became Pharisees. There was some crossover there. But for the most part, the priesthood rejected the idea of an oral Torah completely.
Some priests were Sadducees, but the priests were not the keepers of the law. The keepers of the law were the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin, once again, was virtually entirely made up of Pharisees. But we're going to get more into his fallacious historical claims in a second.
But not only the Sadducees are rejecting the oral law, the Essenes are rejecting the oral law of the rabbis. Later, the Karaites are rejecting it. Now, you might say, well, okay, so all these various groups are rejecting the idea of an oral law because they don't want to give authority to the Pharisees, to the rabbis.
So here Ash does something which Christian missionaries tend to do a lot. They sort of try to imply that there was this large variation in Jewish beliefs in the first century. And they do this to sort of muddy the waters and imply that Christianity was a valid sect at the time and that many people came to agree with the Christians. Of course, none of this is supported by historical fact, and the total number of Christians likely never exceeded about 1,000 people in the first century CE, which is less than a fraction of a percent of the total Jewish population. But in this case, we're not talking about Christianity, we're talking about the Pharisees. And again, Ash sort of brings up these other groups of people at the time to make the case that the Pharisees were just one of many opinions and not everyone agreed, and who can say what, and the Pharisees just cooked this up. It was some small group of people that no one had ever heard of. So this is eminently not the case. We can prove this from historical sources. The primary source on the sects of the Jews is, of course, Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. We're going to read a couple of passages from Josephus to completely debunk Ash's idea here. Now, the first thing we'll look at is Antiquities of the Jews, Book 13, Chapter 10. What I would now explain is this, that the Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the laws of Moses. And for that reason it is that the Sadducees reject them and say that we are to esteem those observances to be obligatory, which are in the written word, but are not to observe what are derived from the tradition of our forefathers. And concerning these things, it is that great disputes and differences have arisen among them. While the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich, and have not the populace obsequious to them, but the Pharisees have the multitude on their side. But about these two sects and that of the Essenes I have treated accurately in the second book of Jewish Affairs. So we see here very briefly the point that I'd like to make, which is that the Pharisees have the multitude on their side, meaning the vast majority of the population agreed with the Pharisaic ideology, while the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich. Very sad for Ash. The Sadducees were effectively a tiny fringe minority of elites who denied the oral Torah in order to sort of challenge the power of the Pharisees at the time. They were very much a political group rather than a strictly ideological one. And Josephus goes into this a little further in Book 18, where he talks about the quote-unquote 4 sects of the Jews. The Jews had for great wealth 3 sects of philosophy peculiar to themselves, the sect of the Essenes, the sect of the Sadducees, and the third sort of opinions are those called Pharisees, of which sects, although I have already spoken in the second book of the Jewish War, yet I will a little touch upon them now. So he goes into sort of the ideology of the Pharisees. We're not really going to talk about that here. It's not really so relevant, but the point is that they believe in an oral Torah. But over here, Josephus makes it clear that on account of which doctrines they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people. Again, the vast majority of the people agree with the Pharisees. And whatsoever they do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform in them according to their direction, insomuch that the cities give great attestations to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and their discourses also. So we can see the Pharisees here are thought of as virtuous, wise, discerning people, and they persuade the majority of the population to their views. This is not a fringe sect in the same way that the Sadducees or Essenes were. Rather, the Pharisees represented the widespread mainstream Jewish view, as it always has. The doctrine of the Sadducees is this, and then it goes into the beliefs of the Sadducees. Look at this, take a look at this. But they are able to do almost nothing of themselves. These people had virtually no influence in Jewish society. For when they become magistrates, as they are unwillingly and by force sometimes obliged to be, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees, because the multitude would not otherwise bear them. So we see here that once again, the Sadducees do not really genuinely believe in their ideology. It's pretty clear that they dropped it when it was politically convenient in order to be supported by the multitude. And then he goes into the Essenes, and again, it's not really important what their actual ideology is, but he gives their total population, actually. There are about 4,000 men that live in this way, and neither marry wives nor desires to keep servants. So this is another sort of fringe sect, and it doesn't really go into whether they believed in the oral Torah or not. I don't believe they did, but it's again, this was a tiny fringe sect. You're talking about 4,000 out of 4 million Jews at this time. That is 0.1% of the Jewish population. And then he has the fourth sect of Jewish philosophy. This isn't really a fourth sect because, as he says, these men agree in all other things with the Pharisaic notions, but they have an inviolable attachment to liberty. So this is sort of the liberty movement led by Judas the Galilean, and it's again more of a rebellious movement against the Romans rather than a different religious ideology. But the point of all this is to say that the Pharisees were once again very much the mainstream and historical Jewish opinion. They were not some sort of tiny fringe sect in the way that the Sadducees were, or the Essenes were, or the Christians were, who were basically not mentioned in Josephus other than in Testimonium Flavianum, which is well known to be a Christian forgery. And once again, this indicates that the Christians at the time of Josephus were probably a tiny, tiny sect, probably even smaller than the Essenes, because the Essenes, at least, he mentions their population. The Christians probably numbered less than 1,000. That's what I believe Dr. David Sim estimated in his paper. So yeah, Ash is totally unfamiliar with the history here, and he sort of brings them up, these sectarian groups, as evidence that the Pharisees were not the only game in town. But no, the Pharisees were the only game in town. And then again, he brings up the Karaites, but these are, thousands of years after Moses. So, and this is hundreds of years after the Sanhedrin was dissolved. And again, these were a minority of people. So they're not really relevant in any way to Jewish history, and this is like long after, and these Karaites are like long after Jesus and all of these politics of the first century, and were influenced by them in many ways. They were influenced by Islam as well. Like, so to bring up the Karaites is just historically meaningless. But it's important to at least contextualize the first century and understand that the Pharisees were the dominant force in Judaism because this was the rabbinic tradition, which has always been the dominant and correct force in rabbinic Judaism, governed by the decisions of the Sanhedrin. Yeah, so there's no evidence that the Ethiopians go back to the First Temple period. The first mention of any Jews in Ethiopia comes in the 9th century CE, and the first mention of Beta Yisrael, which is the Ethiopian group in question, comes as late as the 14th century CE. So this is once again not evidence of a lack of oral tradition. This was a group that came thousands of years after the oral tradition, and by all likelihood were not actually Jews. They may have had contact with some Jews or even some Christians in the second millennium who influenced them to have practices that sort of resembled Jews. But there's no evidence that these were some sort of breakaway sect of Jews, and certainly not evidence that they were a breakaway sect from the First Temple period. That is absurd.
So I don't want to sit here saying that the Jewish community is bad because they believe in rabbinic culture. That's not what I'm saying at all. That being said, I do want to point out that one of the most problematic things with the rabbinic tradition is some of the toxic fruits of its belief system. If the Jewish community could do away with this notion that it is divinely inspired, that the rabbis have some kind of Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration to their rulings and debates, and simply accept it as a tradition, then they could do away with all of the problematic parts, and they could keep their beautiful traditions without claiming that it's from God. It could just be your heritage and your culture.
Yeah, no. Simply to say it's a tradition is not sufficient, because once again, God commanded a particular law to the Jewish people, and it's incumbent upon all of us to keep it. So to just say, oh, it's a nice tradition, oh, it's nice. No, this is totally contrary to the will of God, and if you do so, then you're abandoning your heritage. And also you're simply going against history, logic, and reason, and following a totally farcical religion like Christianity, which is both based on Judaism but also rejects it simultaneously, which leads to all sorts of absurdities.
There's no problem with that. The problem is when you claim that these rabbis, all of what they say, all the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud, these and these are all words of God, you have a really big problem because of some of these sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud said some pretty wacky things and some pretty vile things. Even later rabbis that we hold in great esteem in Jewish culture have said some pretty problematic things. Whether it's Rabbi Gamliel, who's one of the greatest sages in Jewish history, saying that to test a woman's virginity, you can sit her on a wine barrel and smell her breath, and if the wine smell comes through, she's not a virgin. Very scientific and a little bit disgusting. Whether it's the rabbi sitting having discussions about which parts of a young girl develop first, don't know why that's necessary to know about.
So ironic, considering Rabban Gamliel is actually found in the New Testament. By the way, the New Testament attests to the oral tradition in like a million different places and says that it goes back to Moses in Matthew 23 too. But anyway, Rabban Gamliel is found in the New Testament. So the fact that he's willing to vilify him shows how little he knows even about his own religion that he's trying to now adhere to, because Paul claims to be a student of Rebbe Gamliel. As to the ages of girls, I mean, again, Jewish law is relevant to every single part of life. So why would it not include the life cycle of boys and girls and adults at every part of their life and at all ages? This is just like a very common smear that you see online of people who have basically never read the Talmud, just cherry picking passages that are convenient for them to disparage the Jewish people. And it's part of why I'm very skeptical that Ash is actually halakhically Jewish. A lot of these sort of types that go to Christianity are not halakhically Jewish in the first place. They're sort of disgruntled with the fact that they're not considered part of the Jewish community, and so they run to things like Christianity. Or it's just that they find the law to be too cumbersome to keep, so they try to find an ideology that lets them get away with doing nothing. I don't know if Ash is Jewish. I have no reason to believe he is or isn't. Simply the fact that he claims he was is, of course, not proof. The fact that he claims to have served in the IDF is also not proof. There are tons of Christians and Arabs in the IDF. But yeah, in general, this is just like a gross smear, and it's sort of a pattern that I've seen of him like smearing the rabbis and rabbinic tradition. These missionaries sort of have to do so because their whole MO is basically questioning the authority of the Sanhedrin in order so that they can supplant the Sanhedrin with the church. But of course, the Sanhedrin was never supplanted, never lost its authority, so there's no possible way to do that. Anyway, I hope this was an informative video for you. I think we've thoroughly debunked all of Ash's ideas here. And yeah, have a nice day.